The first thing Rose Sullivan noticed about Raymond Whitfield was that he never smiled, and the second thing she noticed was that he had the most careful hands she had ever seen on a man who claimed to feel nothing. It was the spring of 1874 when she arrived in Cutter's Creek, Nevada, a town that sat between two mountain ranges like something the land had forgotten to swallow. She came by wagon, sitting straight-backed on a bench seat beside the driver, a half-deaf old man named Gus who had talked about his mule the entire 3-day journey from Reno, as though the animal were a personal philosophy. Rose had listened politely, watched the desert stretch out in every direction like a copper-colored sermon, and kept her hands folded in her lap over the small leather satchel that held everything she owned in the world. She was 23 years old and recently widowed, though widowed felt like too large a word for what had actually happened. Thomas Sullivan had been 31 and had died of a fever in their rented room above a saloon in Reno 6 weeks after their wedding. She had mourned him honestly and briefly, because the honest truth was that she had not loved him the way the poem said a person ought to, and the guilt of that had followed her all the way out here to the high desert where she hoped the wind might carry it off. She had answered an advertisement in the Reno Gazette. A general store in Cutter's Creek, Nevada, was seeking a capable woman to manage the storefront and keep the accounts. The owner, a man named Howard Briggs, had written the advertisement himself and had used the word capable 4 times in 6 sentences, which Rose had taken as a good sign. When she met Howard Briggs in person, she discovered he was 72 years old, had a knee that predicted rain better than any almanac, and wanted nothing more than to sit in the back of his own store and read agricultural pamphlets without being bothered about where the flour was. It was, Rose thought, a very fair arrangement. The store was called Briggs General Goods, and it occupied the widest building on the main street of Cutter's Creek, which was not saying a great deal, because the main street had only 8 buildings, and one of them was a collapsed barn that someone had begun rebuilding 3 years ago and abandoned. The store smelled of cedar and dried tobacco, and something sweet she could not identify at first, and later discovered was a barrel of dried apricots that Howard kept behind the counter because he ate them constantly and saw no reason to make the journey to the shelf. Rose moved into the small room above the store that Howard had cleared out for her, hung her 2 dresses on the nail beside the window, set her satchel under the bed, and went downstairs to begin learning the inventory. She met Raymond Whitfield on her 4th day. He came in on a Thursday, just before noon, and the bell above the door made its small copper sound, and Rose looked up from the ledger she was reviewing to find a man of about 30 standing in the doorway with the particular stillness of someone who was accustomed to entering rooms cautiously. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and jaw that needed shaving and eyes the color of creek water in October, which was to say a gray-green that was not quite one thing or another. He wore a canvas work shirt and leather suspenders and boots that had been resoled recently and carefully, and he carried himself, the way certain men carry themselves after a long time alone, with a kind of deliberate economy, as though every movement had been considered and found strictly necessary. He glanced at Rose with brief, polite acknowledgement, the way one acknowledged a piece of furniture that had been moved to a new location, and then he walked to the counter and set down a folded piece of paper. "Supply list," he said, "same as last month mostly. Howard knows the account." Rose unfolded the paper. It was written in a clear, precise hand, the letters small and even the kind of handwriting produced by someone who had once been taught well and had not forgot, even if everything else in the world had changed since then. She read through the list. Salt, coffee 2 pounds, dried beans 5 pounds, hardtack if available, lamp oil, nails various, rope 20 feet, coarse thread, tin of axle grease, tobacco 1 pouch. She looked up. "Will you be taking it today or coming back for it?" "Today," he said. "Give me about 15 minutes to gather it." He nodded once and moved to the side of the store, not browsing, simply standing out of the way, which she noticed because most men who came into a general store while waiting for their goods found something to touch or examine or rearrange on the shelves. This man stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at a point somewhere in the middle distance and waited with a patience that had nothing relaxed about it. Rose gathered his supplies. She was efficient about it, having already spent 4 days learning where everything was and reorganizing what Howard had allowed to drift into a system that could charitably be called impressionistic. When she set the parcels on the counter and listed the total, Raymond Whitfield paid in exact coin without looking for change and loaded everything into his saddlebags with the same careful economy of motion she had noticed when he walked in. "You're new," he said, without making it a question. "Rose Sullivan," she said. He looked at her for a moment in a way that was not rude but was completely unguarded, as though he were simply processing information. "Raymond Whitfield," he said. "I have a spread about 4 miles northeast of town. Raise cattle mostly, horses some." "I'll remember the account," she said. "Appreciate it." He picked up his saddlebags. "Howard treating you well?" "He let me reorganize the entire north wall without complaint," she said. "I consider that very well indeed." Something moved across Raymond Whitfield's face. It was not quite a smile. It was the architectural suggestion of a smile, the way a house has a fireplace even in summer. And then he was gone, the bell above the door making its small sound again, and Rose stood behind the counter and looked at the door for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Howard Briggs appeared from the back room with his hands full of dried apricots. "Raymond pick up his things?" "Yes," Rose said. "What can you tell me about him?" Howard chewed thoughtfully. "Lost his wife 4 years back. Cholera. Had a son too, the boy was 3 years old. Lost them both in the same week." He shook his head slowly. "Raymond Whitfield was not a cold man before that. Was quite the opposite if you want my honest account. After, though." He shook his head again. "He works his land and he comes to town and he says what's necessary and he goes home. Does his work, does it right, never any trouble. But it's like all the warmth went out of him like a candle being snuffed." He ate another apricot. "Not unkind." "Just done." Rose looked back at the ledger. "Done," she repeated quietly. "That's the word for it," Howard said. "Done with soft things, that's what I'd call it." She thought about that for the rest of the day. She thought about it while she restocked the shelves and tallied the week's receipts and swept the floor and listened to the wind come down off the mountain and push itself through the gaps in the boards. She thought about Raymond Whitfield's hands, which had been careful and exact when he loaded his saddlebags, and the way he had looked at her with those gray-green eyes that contained nothing sentimental and everything observant. She was not a woman who went looking for broken things to fix. She had learned that much from her mother, who had spent 30 years trying to fix Rose's father and had only succeeded in making herself tired. But there was a difference, she thought, between a broken thing and a closed thing. A closed thing was still whole. It was just shut. She filed the thought away and went back to her ledger. Raymond returned the following Thursday, same as clockwork, same list nearly exactly, and again the week after that. By the third visit, Rose had his standard items pre-gathered and wrapped by 11 in the morning, which she did not mention to him, only presented his parcel efficiently when he arrived. He noticed, she could tell, but he didn't remark on it, only counted out his coin with the same precision. It was on his 4th visit that something shifted slightly. He came in on a morning when a spring storm had blown through and left the town thick with mud and a smell of wet sage that Rose found unexpectedly beautiful. She was behind the counter writing a letter to her sister in Sacramento when he came in, and she looked up and noticed that there was mud on his boots and his hat was dark with rain, and he looked like a man who had ridden through the storm rather than waited it out, which told her something about him she stored without examining too closely. "Bad riding this morning," she said. "Nothing the horse couldn't manage." He set his list on the counter. She unfolded it. Same items as usual. She read through it once and then again. Then she picked up a pencil, and before she had consciously decided to do it, she added one word at the bottom of his list: honey. She stared at what she had written for a moment, then set the list back on the counter and went to gather his items. She did not explain it. She placed a small tin of clover honey from the shelf alongside his salt and coffee and rope and oil, and she tallied it into his total without comment. Raymond picked up the tin, looked at it, looked at her. "I didn't ask for this," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I added it. It's good honey, came from a beekeeper over in Elko. If you don't want it, I'll put it back." He held the tin for a moment. His face was unreadable, but she was beginning to learn the small grammar of his expressions, the way his jaw moved slightly when he was working something out, the way his eyes shifted downward when he was considering rather than when he was dismissing. He was considering. "How much?" he said. "It's already in the total." He didn't put it in his saddlebag for a long moment. He stood there with it in his hand and looked at it the way a person looks at something unexpected that they are not sure whether to be grateful for or suspicious of. Then he put it in the bag. "Thank you," he said, and his voice had something in it that hadn't been there before. Not softness exactly, but an opening, the way a window sounds different when it isn't entirely latched. He came back the following Thursday. Rose watched him come through the door with the same deliberate stillness, crossed the floor with the same measured steps, and set his list on the counter. She unfolded it, looked at the bottom. He had added honey himself. It was written in his small, careful hand at the very bottom of the list, just after coarse thread. Honey, 1 tin. Rose looked at the list for one long, quiet moment. She felt something move in her chest that was warm and careful, and precisely the size of a small tin of clover honey. She gathered his supplies and did not say anything about it, and he picked them up and paid and did not say anything about it. And the tin of honey went into his saddlebag with everything else, and the bell above the door made its sound, and Rose stood behind the counter with a feeling she would not name yet, only hold, the way you hold a small flame against the wind. The weeks moved forward the way weeks do in desert country, with a kind of relentless openness that made every day feel both large and strangely intimate. Rose settled into Cutter's Creek the way she had not expected to settle anywhere again, which was to say not all at once but piece by piece, the way a person builds a fire in wind, finding what will hold. She got to know the other people of the town. There was Patience Eccles, who ran the boarding house and had opinions about everything with the cheerful confidence of someone who had never been wrong and did not anticipate starting. There was the Navarro family, who had been in the territory long before the town, and ran the small blacksmith operation at the far end of the street. Miguel Navarro doing the ironwork with his 2 eldest sons. His wife Catalina growing herbs along every windowsill of their house, in a way that made it smell like somewhere else entirely. There was a young woman named Clara Dietz who taught the 8 children of Cutter's Creek in the one-room schoolhouse and cried quietly on Friday afternoons because she missed her mother in Virginia and was not ashamed to say so. Rose liked them all, in varying degrees and for varying reasons. But the person she found herself thinking about on the long evenings when the store was closed and the desert turned violet and gold outside her window was Raymond Whitfield. He came to town every Thursday without fail, and on those days he collected his supplies and occasionally, not every time but sometimes, he would remain for a few minutes after the transaction. Not lingering exactly. Standing at the counter while she made some notation in the ledger, and finding something to say that was not required by the situation. He asked her once if the Elko beekeeper had sent a new shipment. She said yes, 2 cases, and he nodded and said the honey was good, the sweetest he had had in some years, and then he was quiet for a moment and she was quiet too, and the silence between them was the kind that doesn't need to be filled. He asked her another time how she found the desert, whether it was what she had expected. She told him that she had expected it to be empty, and found instead that it was full of a different kind of fullness than she was accustomed to, that there was more going on in a square mile of high Nevada desert than in a year of streets and buildings. You just had to be paying attention on a different frequency. Raymond had looked at her for a moment after that with an expression she could not categorize, but that felt, somehow, like recognition. Like a person seeing in writing a sentence they have long held in their own mind but had not been able to articulate. "That's right," he said. "That's exactly right." And then he left, but that was the day she stopped filing the thought of him away and started keeping it somewhere more accessible. It was Patience Eccles who told her more of the story. One afternoon in May, when Rose had come to the boarding house to deliver a package Howard had taken in on Patience's behalf, and Patience had insisted she stay for coffee and a piece of dried apple cake that was better than it had any right to be. "You've been talking to Raymond Whitfield," Patience said, with the casual certainty of a woman who noticed everything and pretended to notice nothing. "He's a regular customer," Rose said. Patience poured coffee into an enamel cup and handed it over. "He was a different man before Eleanor died, his wife. She was a remarkable woman, warm as a stove in winter, always had something kind to say about everyone, and she meant every word of it, which is the part that's rare. Those two were," Patience paused, searching for the word, "matched, like two of the same kind of thing. She softened him and he steadied her, and together they were the kind of couple you watched and thought, yes, that is what it is supposed to look like." Rose held her coffee cup and did not say anything. Then the cholera came through in the summer of '70. Eleanor went in 3 days. The boy, James, he was 3, he lasted 2 more days after his mother. Patience's face was somber with the weight of it. "Raymond found me on the street the day after James died and told me in a voice like he was reporting on the weather, and then he went home and I did not see him in town for 6 weeks. When he came back, he was this." She gestured with her hand in a way that conveyed closure, sealed, done. "Has he spoken of them?" Rose asked. "Never, not once in 4 years. He paid for 2 headstones from Reno and planted them on his property. And that's the only acknowledgement he's ever made publicly, that he had a family and lost it." Rose was quiet for a moment. Outside the window of the boarding house, the afternoon was yellow and hot and perfectly still. "He adds the honey to his own list now," she said, and was not sure why she said it. Patience looked at her steadily over the rim of her cup. "Does he?" she said, not as a question. "Every week," Rose said. "He started doing it the week after I put it on there without him asking." Patience set her cup down. "Rose Sullivan," she said, "I have lived in this territory for 17 years and I have watched that man come and go for 4 of them. He has not added a single non-essential item to his supply list in all that time. Not once." Rose looked at her coffee. "Honey is non-essential," Patience said, with the careful emphasis of a woman making a point. "I know," Rose said quietly. "Interesting," said Patience, and refilled both their cups. The thing about Raymond Whitfield, Rose was coming to understand, was that he was not cold. He had been wrongly described as cold even inside her own mind, and she wanted to correct that. Cold implied an absence of temperature, a failure of warmth. What Raymond was contained. He was like a fire built very carefully inside a very strong enclosure, the heat entirely real and entirely present, just directed inward, banked against all outward expression. You could feel it if you stood close enough. You could feel it in the way he listened when she spoke, with a quality of attention that was almost startling in its completeness, as though everything she said was being considered with the same seriousness he brought to fence repair, or the reading of the sky for weather. You could feel it in the care he took with small things, the way he counted out his coin so that she never had to make change, the way he always removed his hat when he came through the door of the store, not with the performative gallantry of a man trying to make an impression, but with the plain courtesy of a man who had been raised to respect interiors. She found herself, on a Tuesday evening in late May, doing something she had not planned to do. She found herself writing out his supply list from memory, just to see if she could do it. She could. Every item, correct quantities, correct order, because she had read that list every Thursday for 2 months, and it had arranged itself in her mind the way certain things arrange themselves when you are paying attention without meaning to. At the bottom of the list she had written, in her own handwriting, honey." She looked at it for a long time. Then she folded the paper and put it in the pocket of her apron and went to bed. On the Thursday of the following week, Raymond came in as always and set his list on the counter. Rose unfolded it, read it, and felt a small, precise acceleration of her heartbeat. He had added beneath honey one additional line. It was written very carefully, smaller than the rest, as if he had debated including it. Dried apricots if available. Howard ate dried apricots constantly. There was a barrel of them behind the counter. They were, in the taxonomy of general store goods, categorically non-essential. Rose looked up at Raymond with an expression she could not entirely control, something between warmth and amusement and something else that was neither of those things but contained both of them. He was looking back at her. His gray-green eyes were entirely serious, but there was something around them, not quite at the eyes themselves, but just beyond them in the lines of his face, that was, she thought, a kind of hope. Quiet and cautious and aware of itself, but hope nonetheless. "We have apricots," she said. "Good," he said. She added them to his parcel and tallied them into the total, and he paid and loaded his bags and put his hat back on, and then he paused at the door with his hand on the frame and turned back to look at her, and there was a moment, maybe 3 seconds long, maybe the length of a small eternity, where neither of them said anything. "I'll be in Thursday," he said. "I'll be here," she said. He left, and the bell made its sound, and Rose stood behind the counter feeling as though the room had shifted 3 degrees on its axis. Not enough to disturb anything structurally, but enough to notice. It was Howard, who noticed more than he let on and said less than he knew, who spoke to her about it one morning while she was restocking the glass-fronted cases. He was in his chair at the back eating his apricots with the philosophical patience of a man who had lived long enough to see most things come around at least twice. "Raymond's a good man," Howard said, to no one in particular. "I know," Rose said. "Lost a great deal." "I know that too." Howard was quiet for a moment. "He's been coming here every Thursday for 4 years. Before that, it was a leaner who did the shopping. She always brought James, had him on her hip or toddling beside her, and she'd spend an hour going through the store talking to whoever was in, and Raymond would come fetch the wagon." He paused. "After he came himself, stopped spending any extra time, in and out, precise, efficient, until recently." Rose straightened a row of tins and said nothing. "He stayed 22 minutes last Thursday," Howard said. "I counted." Rose turned to look at him. He was eating an apricot with an expression of perfect innocence. "You counted," she said. "Old men count things," he said serenely. "It gives us something to do." Rose turned back to the shelf and arranged 3 identical tins that did not require arranging. "He's a good man," she said quietly, and the words felt like something that had been waiting to be said aloud. "Yes, he is," Howard agreed. "Has been and will be, I expect. Just needed someone to remind him." Summer came to Cutter's Creek with an intensity that Rose had been told to expect and still found astonishing. The days were white with heat, and the nights cooled suddenly and completely. The sky swung so full of stars that it looked architectural, like something built with intention. The desert changed color 4 times between morning and evening, and smelled different after every shift, and Rose had fallen into a love with this landscape that surprised her with its completeness. She also fell into a rhythm with Raymond Whitfield that she could not have predicted and could not have planned and would not have changed. He began staying longer on Thursdays. 20 minutes became 30, became an hour on the week in June when a thunderstorm came down off the mountains just as he arrived, and he stood at the window with Rose behind the counter, and they watched the lightning move across the ridgeline like a slow, magnificent argument. And he said, without turning from the window, that he had once ridden out in a storm like that to bring in a stray horse, and a leaner had met him at the barn door afterward with a lantern and a blanket and fury in her voice, because she hadn't known where he'd gone. It was the first time he had spoken a leaner's name in her presence, and Rose kept herself very still when he said it, the way you keep still when a wild thing comes close, not to frighten it back. "She sounds like someone who meant what she said," Rose offered. Every word, Raymond said. She never said anything she didn't mean, didn't have the patience for it, a long pause. I miss that sometimes, knowing that every word was true. I try to do the same, Rose said. It's harder than it sounds. He turned from the window then and looked at her directly, and the lightning outside lit the room in a single clean white flash that caught his face in perfect clarity. And what she saw there was a man who was not done, not really, only waiting, the way certain landscapes look barren and reveal themselves in spring to have been full the whole time. I believe you, he said. That it's true what you say. I believe that about you. The rain came harder, and neither of them spoke for a few minutes, and the silence was the best kind, the kind that means both people are comfortable in the same moment rather than searching for words to fill it. He rode home when the storm eased, and Rose watched him go from the doorway with the smell of wet sage in the air, and her heart doing something that she acknowledged now, fully and without qualification, as being very much in love with Raymond Whitfield. She was not afraid of the feeling. She had not loved Thomas Sullivan with anything like this, had not expected to love anyone with anything like this, had been half convinced since her mother's tired marriage and her own brief and bewildering first one that love of this particular quality, this texture, this weight, might not be available to her. But here it was, entirely present, entirely real. The question was whether Raymond was ready for it, and she did not think the question would answer itself quickly, and she was, she decided, prepared to wait. She had not counted on the situation being resolved in quite the way it was. It was the second week of July when Hector Crane came to town. Hector Crane was not a bad man in the way that some men in that country were bad, which was to say he was not violent for the pleasure of it, and he did not steal from the weak, and he had a code of some kind, however self-serving. But he was the sort of man who thought that the world arranged itself according to what he wanted, and was willing to apply pressure until that arrangement was achieved. He had come to Cutter's Creek because he was interested in acquiring some of the smaller cattle operations in the area, combining them into something larger, and he had heard that the Whitfield spread was among the better pieces of land available, with good water access from the creek that gave the town its name. He came into Briggs General Goods on a Tuesday, which was not a day Rose associated with trouble, and introduced himself with the kind of practiced charm that she had learned to read accurately, surface politeness deployed as a reconnaissance tool. "Miss Sullivan," he said, because someone had told him her name. "I understand you have the management of this establishment. Fine-looking place, good inventory." "Thank you," Rose said. "Can I help you with something?" "Just getting to know the town," he said. He walked along the shelves with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at things, evaluating. "You know most of the ranchers in the area?" "Some," she said carefully. "Raymond Whitfield, know him well." Rose kept her face neutral with the discipline she had developed over years of difficult conversations. "He's a regular customer. I've been trying to arrange a meeting with him. He's not the most accessible man." Crane smiled, and it was a smile that had been worked on. "Perhaps you could put in a word. Tell him I'm a reasonable man interested in a fair deal." "I would suggest," Rose said pleasantly, "that you ride out to his property and speak with him directly. He's a straightforward man, and I think he'd prefer that approach." Crane looked at her for a moment with eyes that were recalibrating. "Of course," he said. "Good thinking." He left, and Rose watched him go, and then she did something she had not done before. On that same Tuesday, rather than waiting for Thursday, she closed the store at noon, which Howard permitted with the serenity of a man who had no objections to anything, and she saddled the bay mare that Howard kept for occasional use and rode the 4 miles northeast to Raymond Whitfield's property. She had not been there before. She had constructed it in her mind from the items on his supply lists, from the occasional detail he let fall, but the actual land surprised her. It was beautiful in a way that was earned rather than given. A modest house of squared timber and good adobe, a barn in sound repair, fencing that ran in clean lines over the hillside, cattle visible in the middle distance moving slowly in the afternoon heat, and beyond all of it, the mountain rising like a statement. There was a vegetable garden beside the house, not elaborate but productive, and she noticed that it was tended with the same careful precision as everything else that was Raymond's. He came out of the barn when he heard the horse and stood looking at her with an expression that was surprised, plainly, in a way he did not bother to conceal. "Rose," he said, and the use of her first name was something she felt move through her like warm water. "Raymond," she said, and swung down from the mare. "I have something to tell you, and I thought it was better told in person than mentioned on a Thursday. A man named Hector Crane came into the store this morning asking about you." Raymond's expression settled into something attentive and flat. "What kind of asking?" "The kind that's dressed up as friendly but isn't." She told him what Crane had said and how he had said it, accurately and with the detail she had registered, because she had always had good instincts for the distinction between a direct thing and an indirect thing, and Crane's interest in Raymond had been entirely indirect. Raymond listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking past her at some point in the distance, working through it. "Crane's been buying out smaller spreads to the south," he said. "Heard about it from the Navarro boys last month. Figured it would come here eventually. Will you sell?" He looked at her with an expression that was almost affronted. "No." "I thought not," she said, and tried not to sound as relieved as she was. This was his land, his and Aline's and James's, even if they were gone. It belonged to what he had loved, and she understood with the certainty of a woman who understood that some things cannot be negotiated, that he would not give it up. "I appreciate you coming to tell me," he said. And then, with a slight pause that was barely perceptible but that she caught, "Will you stay for coffee? It would be." He stopped. She looked at him. He was standing with his hat in his hands, which he had removed when she dismounted, turning it by the brim in a slow circle, and he was looking at the hat rather than at her, and it occurred to her that Raymond Whitfield, who was so precisely contained in every other respect, was nervous. The recognition of it broke something open in her chest, softly, like the first morning of a new season. "I would like that very much," she said. The inside of his house was spare and clean, and had the quality of a place maintained by someone who cared about order without caring about decoration, with one exception. On the windowsill above the kitchen table, in a blue glass jar, there was a bunch of dried wildflowers. They were long past fresh, had been dried deliberately and set in the jar, and they were the only ornamental object in the entire room. She did not ask about them, but she noticed them, and she thought she understood. He made coffee on the iron stove and set 2 cups on the table, and they sat across from each other in the late afternoon light, and they talked for 2 hours. She had not known they could talk like that, though in retrospect she should have known, because every Thursday when he stayed past his necessary time, the conversation had the quality of water finding its own level, natural and easy, and going exactly where it wanted to go. Here, in his kitchen, with the afternoon going gold outside the windows and the smell of coffee between them, it was the same quality amplified. He talked about the cattle, about the land, about what he had found when he first arrived in Nevada 8 years ago that had made him decide to stay. He talked about the way the creek ran in spring, full and fast and cold, and how you could hear it from the bedroom window if you left the window open. He talked about the mountains, the specific quality of the light on them in the early morning, the way the snow cap held until June some years. He did not talk about Aline or James, but he spoke of the land as though it held them, which it did, in the way that land always holds what has lived on it, and Rose listened to all of it with the full attention she gave to things that mattered to her. She told him about Sacramento, where she had grown up, her father's hardware business, her mother's garden. She told him about her brief marriage to Thomas Sullivan without flinching from it, because she had decided long ago that shame was not a productive response to grief, however uncomplicated, and she was not ashamed. Thomas had been a decent man who had died too young, and she had mourned him as honestly as she could, and she had come west afterward looking for something she could not name, and had found Cutter's Creek and found the desert and found, now, This kitchen and this man sitting across from her with his coffee cup held in both hands and his gray-green eyes entirely present. "You're not sorry you came," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," she said. "I think I came exactly where I was supposed to come." He looked at her over his coffee cup, and the afternoon light was full and amber and caught the planes of his face in a way that made her aware, once again, that he was a remarkably handsome man who had probably not thought about that in 4 years. "I'm glad you came to the store," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "I'm glad Howard hired you." "So am I," she said. The ride home was in the long lavender light of evening, and Rose sang very quietly to herself the whole 4 miles, which she had not done since she was a girl, and the desert was full and warm around her, and the sky was putting on its full performance of color, and she was happy in a way that felt like territory she was just beginning to map. Hector Crane came back to the store the following Saturday, and he was less pleasant this time. He had apparently gone to Raymond's property, and Raymond had declined his offer with a clarity that Crane found difficult to accept, because he came into Briggs General Goods with an edge to him that he was not entirely concealing. "Your friend out there is making a mistake," he said, as though continuing a conversation. "Mr. Whitfield is a grown man who makes his own decisions," Rose said from behind the counter. "Land like that, water access like he has, he's sitting on something valuable he's got no use for alone." Crane put his hands on the counter and leaned slightly. "You could tell him that. Coming from you, maybe he'd hear it." Rose looked at him with complete steadiness. "With respect, Mr. Crane, this is a general store, not a telegraph service. I sell goods and keep accounts. I don't deliver other men's business proposals to my customers. Now, is there something I can help you with today?" Crane looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression that was not quite a threat, not in any overt way, but was the outline of one. "You're very confident," he said. "I know my work and I do it well," she said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Crane." He left, and Rose let out a slow breath through her nose, and Howard appeared from the back room with his customary serenity. "That man is going to be unpleasant before he's done," Howard said. "Yes," Rose agreed. "I think so too." She sent word to Raymond through Miguel Navarro's eldest son, who passed the Whitfield property on his way to and from town most days. Her note was brief. Crane was in the store again, more insistent. "Be careful." Raymond's reply came back that same afternoon, written on the back of her note. "Thank you. Am careful. We'll see you Thursday." Which was not Thursday yet, but on Wednesday evening, when Rose was closing up the store and Howard had already gone upstairs. She heard hooves outside and looked through the window and saw Raymond Whitfield dismounting at the rail. She went to the door. He came up the steps in the dusk, hat in hand, and he had clearly ridden straight from work because there was dust on his shirt, and he had not stopped to change. He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read in the low light, but that had an urgency to it, not alarmed but direct, the way a man looks when he has decided to say something and has come specifically to say it. "I know it's not Thursday," he said. "I noticed," she said. "I came because—" He stopped, turned the hat, started again. "You came to warn me last week, and that was a thing that, it mattered. You didn't have to do that. And I've been thinking about that, and about a lot of things, and I thought I should say something rather than not say it." Rose stood in the doorway and held the edge of the door and waited with everything she had. "I've been—" He seemed to be working through something that was difficult, not because it was complicated but because it was true, and true things are sometimes the hardest to say. "I've been shutting things out for a long time, and I thought that was the right thing, the only thing. After losing Alina and James, I didn't think I had any right to want anything soft or good, because wanting things like that and then losing them was—" He stopped again. "It seemed like the only protection." "I understand that," she said, very quietly. "But the honey—" He said it with something almost like disbelief, as though the object itself had been the mechanism of something larger. "You put that honey on my list, and I stood there holding it, and I thought, this is a soft thing. This is a kind thing that someone did because they thought I might enjoy it. And I put it in my bag and I took it home, and that night I had some on bread with my coffee, and I thought. He laughed, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh, a short, wondering sound. I thought, this is very good. This is something I would like to keep having. He looked at her directly. And then the next week I put it on my own list, and the whole ride home I was trying to figure out why it felt like such a large thing to have done, and it took me the better part of a month to understand that it wasn't about the honey. Rose's hand on the door frame was entirely still. It was about you, he said. It was about deciding that I wanted something good and going back for it. He held her gaze. I'm not a man who makes pretty speeches, and I don't have much to offer in the way of comfort or softness yet, but I am honest, and I am steady, and I intend to be here a long time. And I would like very much, if you would allow it, to come calling on you properly. To see if what I think this is what I think it is. Rose looked at him for a long moment, standing in his dusty shirt in the dusk on her doorstep with his hat in his hands and his gray-green eyes entirely, completely open. You came on a Wednesday, she said. Yes. That is a highly non-standard Thursday visit. I know. It suggests a degree of impatience. It does, he said, and something warm came into his voice. Are you going to make me stand on this step, or are you going to answer me? Rose Sullivan smiled at him, and it was the kind of smile that a person produces when something so precisely matches what they have been hoping for that their face does not know what else to do. Yes, she said, I will allow you to come calling. I have been waiting for you to say something like that since approximately the second Thursday in April. He stared at her. That long? Raymond, she said, I put honey on your supply list. Yes, that long. He laughed again, properly this time, a real sound, full and warm, and it transformed his face so completely that she felt the sight of it like something physical, the way you feel the first warm day after a long winter, all along your skin at once. He came calling on Sunday, because they agreed on Sunday, and he arrived at the appointed time, and he had shaved, and his shirt was clean, and he had brought her a small bunch of wildflowers, the same variety as the dried ones in the blue jar on his kitchen windowsill. And she looked at the flowers and looked at him and understood without either of them saying it that this was significant, that he was bringing out into the world something that had been kept private, honoring the memory and choosing to move past it at the same time, which was the only honest way to do such a thing. They walked the length of the main street and around the outside of the town and out to where the creek ran, still moving in July though slower than in spring, clear over smooth brown stones, and they talked for 4 hours, and the time went the way time goes when you are in exactly the right company, which is to say it went quickly and felt complete. Crane made one more attempt in early August, and it was the most direct of the three. He came to Raymond's property with 2 other men, not armed in a threatening way but present in a way that was intended to suggest volume and consequence, and he made his offer again with the additional persuasion of a figure that was not quite fair but could be argued as approaching it, and Raymond declined again. And when Crane implied that it would be easier to sell now than to deal with difficulties later, Raymond looked at him with gray-green eyes that contained absolutely no uncertainty and said, very calmly, that his land was not for sale, and that if Crane or his associates created any difficulty on his property or in his town, he would take the matter to the county marshal in Elko and would be articulate about it. Crane left. He went on to try his consolidation scheme elsewhere, and while things were not easy for some of the smaller ranchers in the valley to the south, Cutter's Creek remained unmolested, partly because Raymond had indeed sent a letter to the county marshal in Elko describing Crane's methods, and the marshal had apparently found it informative. Rose heard the account from Miguel Navarro, who heard it from his son, who had been mending fencing nearby during the confrontation. She did not ask Raymond about it directly. She waited until their next Sunday walk, and when he mentioned it himself briefly and without drama, she said, I'm glad you stood firm, and he said, I wasn't going to do anything else. And then they walked on beside the creek, and the conversation moved to other things. In September, the heat broke and the evenings turned cool, and the aspen on the hillsides went gold and trembling, and the world became extravagantly beautiful in the way it does in that country in fall, all warmth and color and the specific poignancy of something lovely that knows it is temporary. Raymond and Rose had been keeping regular company for 2 months by then, Sundays always and sometimes an extra evening in the week, and things had grown between them with the organic rightness of something that was simply following its own nature. He had kissed her for the first time on a September evening on the porch of the store, after a long walk in the cooling air, and it had been exactly the kind of kiss she had thought it would be, careful and genuine and containing, once you were inside it, a heat that had nothing careful about it at all. He held her face in those careful hands and kissed her like a man who meant it and had thought about meaning it for some time, and when he stepped back his expression was open in a way she had never seen from him before, entirely unguarded, and he said, "I've wanted to do that since May." "May," she said. "When you told me that the desert was full rather than empty," he said. "Something happened when you said that." She reached up and touched his jaw with her fingertips, the way she had been thinking about doing for months, and felt him turn very slightly toward the touch, involuntary like a plant toward light. "I think you should come calling more than once a week," she said. He caught her hand and held it. "I think so too," he said. The fall deepened and so did everything between them, in the unhurried way of people who were both old enough to know that what they had was real and to want to do it properly. Raymond came to town more often, not always with a list, sometimes just to sit at the counter for an hour while Rose finished the day's accounts and Howard read his agricultural pamphlets in the back, the three of them in a comfortable domestic arrangement that felt already somehow like something established rather than something new. Patience Eccles watched this development with the satisfaction of a woman whose instincts had once again been proven correct, and she remarked to Clara Dietz, who told Miguel Navarro's wife Catalina, that Raymond Whitfield was going to ask Rose Sullivan to marry him before snow, and she would eat her second-best hat if she was wrong. She was not wrong. He asked her in October, on a Sunday afternoon when they had ridden up into the hills behind his property, to where a stand of aspen went gold all the way to the top of the ridge, and the air smelled of pine, and the cold was coming in clean from the north. They had stopped to let the horses rest, and Raymond had dismounted and helped her down from the bay mare in the way he always did, not because she needed it, but because he liked to. She had understood that he liked the small ceremony of it, the moment of contact. He did not get down on one knee because the ground was rocky and he was a practical man, but he held both her hands in both of his and looked at her with his gray-green eyes entirely clear, and he said, "I know I am not an easy man. I am not as warm as I once was, though I think you are bringing that back, and I know I have a sadness in me that does not entirely go away. But I love you, Rose. I have loved you, I think, since May, but certainly since every Thursday after you put the honey on that list, and I understood what it meant to decide to go back for something good. I want you to come live on this land with me. I want to build a life that is, again, the kind of life worth living." He paused. "Will you marry me?" Rose Sullivan looked at Raymond Whitfield in the aspen grove with the gold light falling through the leaves and moving on his face like water, and she felt the full, complete, unhesitating answer rise in her with no qualifications and no conditions attached. "Yes," she said. "Raymond, yes." He exhaled, and it was the exhale of a man who has been holding something in for a long time, and then he pulled her close and held her the way he had been wanting to hold her, she suspected, for a great many Thursdays, and she put her face against his neck and felt his heart beating and thought, with the clarity that comes sometimes when a thing is exactly right, that she had arrived precisely where she was supposed to be. They were married in November, the first Saturday after the first light snow, in a ceremony conducted by a circuit preacher who came through Cutter's Creek twice a year, and who, on this occasion, was pleased to find a full audience in the town's small church, because the wedding of Raymond Whitfield and Rose Sullivan had drawn everyone from within 10 miles who had heard the news, which was everyone. Patience Eccles cried and denied it. Howard Briggs wore his best coat and ate apricots discreetly throughout. The Navarro family sat in the front row, and Catalina had brought dried herbs for good luck, which she pressed into Rose's hands before the ceremony, with a warmth that made Rose's throat ache with gratitude. Clara Dietz played the small organ in the corner that was slightly out of tune, but entirely sincere. Rose wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered through the store, a deep blue wool that was good for the cold weather, and that she had trimmed with a white collar. She had embroidered in the evenings by lamplight, small flowers in white thread, roses obviously, which made her laugh quietly to herself every time she worked on it. Raymond wore a dark suit that he had traveled to Elko to purchase, and that fit him well. He looked, Rose thought, like a man who had come back to himself from a long distance, like someone returning from a journey he had been on without meaning to take. He looked present. He looked warm. He stood beside her at the front of the church and took her hand, and when the preacher read the vows and asked him to repeat them, Raymond looked at her rather than at the preacher and said every word directly to her, quietly and with absolute conviction, and she looked back at him and said hers the same way. When the preacher pronounced them married and Raymond kissed his wife in the small out-of-tune church in Cutter's Creek, Nevada in November 1874, the sound that went up from the assembled townsfolk was genuine and warm, and something that Rose would remember for the rest of her life, as the sound of a community celebrating something it had genuinely needed. She moved to the Whitfield property that same week, and the process of making it a shared home was one of the most purely pleasant experiences she had known. Raymond had, without discussion, made space in the wardrobe and cleared 2 drawers and put a mirror above the washstand, small preparations that she found unbearably touching in their care and practical consideration. She brought her own things, which were not many but were hers, her books, her small sewing box, the quilted coverlet her mother had made her, the glass inkwell and the pen set that she had bought herself in Sacramento as a reminder that her words and accounts and letters mattered. She also brought a second tin of honey from the store, setting it on the kitchen shelf beside the one already there, and Raymond, coming in from the barn to find her unpacking, looked at the shelf and looked at her and smiled with his whole face, which she was now seeing regularly and which never failed to move her. 2 tins, he said. In case we run out, she said. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her, and this was the beginning of a pattern that she loved. The small domestic kisses that were different from the courtship kisses, less electric perhaps but deeper, the kisses of people who are choosing each other continually rather than seeking each other for the first time. Winter came and was cold and clean, and they were warm inside it, and the rhythm of the ranch established itself around her. Rose kept her position at Briggs General Goods, riding to town Monday through Saturday and home each evening, and this arrangement suited them both well, giving each a portion of the day that was their own and making the evenings, when they came together for supper and the hours after, feel like something arrived at rather than something assumed. Raymond talked more than he had. The deliberate economy of his speech had not changed in its quality but had changed in its quantity, and she was privy now to his thoughts in a way that she treasured, because Raymond Whitfield, when he thought out loud, was illuminating, the observations precise, and the connections between things unexpected and usually right. He noticed the world the way she noticed it, with that other frequency, the one that picked up what was present beneath the visible surface, and their conversations in the evenings beside the stove became something she looked forward to with the same consistency as food or sleep. He told her about Alina that winter, not all at once but across several evenings, offering pieces of the story the way someone carefully excavates something precious, knowing the value of it and not wanting to break anything. He told her about meeting Alina in Missouri, where they had both been from, about her laugh and her certainty, and the way she had decided she was going to marry him approximately 3 weeks before he had understood he was in love with her, and had proceeded accordingly. He told her about the journey west, the wagon across the plains, Alina 9 months pregnant and completely untroubled by this situation, having decided it would be fine and therefore it would. He told her about James, who had been born 6 weeks after they arrived in Nevada, who had been a solemn and thoughtful baby who became a solemn and curious toddler, who had walked at 11 months and said his first word at 7 months, which was not mama or papa but was creek, which Raymond could only explain by the fact that he had taken the boy to the creek nearly every day. Rose listened to all of it with the full quality of attention she gave to things that mattered. She cried once quietly when he told her about James's last days, and he put his arm around her and held her and said, very quietly, "Thank you for crying for him. No one has done that in front of me before." And she held on to him and thought about the weight of grief carried alone, the particular cruelty of it, and was glad with everything she was that he did not have to carry it alone anymore. "They were yours," she said, "and they still are, and they'll always be part of this land and this home. I wouldn't want it any other way." He was quiet for a long moment, his hand moving slowly in her hair. "I know," he said. "I know you wouldn't. That's one of the reasons, Rose. That's one of the many reasons." Spring came back to Cutter's Creek in 1875, with its particular extravagance of green and water, the creek running high and fast and cold, the hillsides blooming in ways that seemed impossible after the brown severity of winter, and with the spring Rose discovered that she was expecting a child. She sat with the knowledge for 3 days before she told Raymond, not because she was uncertain about telling him, but because she wanted to hold it by herself for a little while first, to understand what she felt about it. What she felt about it, she found, was a steadiness that surprised her with its depth, a readiness, a sense that this was right and that she was ready, that they were ready, and that this land that already held so much love in its red soil was prepared to hold more. She told him on a Thursday evening because Thursday felt appropriate, because Thursday had started everything. She told him after supper, sitting at the kitchen table in the lamplight with the last of the honey from the first tin on a piece of bread beside the second, already opened tin, and she said it plainly the way she said all true things. "Raymond, I'm expecting a child. The baby will come in November, I think." He was very still for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took both her hands in his, and she watched his face do the thing she had seen it do for the first time in the aspen grove, open fully, without reserve, every contained thing released at once. "Are you well?" he said. His voice was thick with something. "I'm very well," she said. "Entirely well." He stood up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down in front of her chair and looked up at her with those gray-green eyes that were, she saw with a tenderness so complete it nearly undid her, full of tears he had not shed. "Rose," he said, and that was all he said, but it contained everything. She put her hands on his face. "It's going to be all right," she said. "I know you're afraid, that makes sense, but it's going to be all right. And whatever happens, you are not alone in it." He pressed his face briefly into her hands, and then he stood up and held her against him carefully, the way he held everything he cared about, with a precision that was itself a form of love. Summer passed and Rose worked through most of it, though she and Howard agreed that a second person was needed in the store, and they took on a young woman named Delia Marsh, who had come to Cutter's Creek with her family the previous fall, and who turned out to have a gift for mental arithmetic that Howard regarded with unconcealed delight. Rose trained Delia through the summer, and by September felt confident leaving the store in her capable hands for days at a time. Raymond was, she discovered, a man who found it very difficult not to worry and found it equally difficult to express worry because expressing it made it more real, which meant that his care for her during the pregnancy took the form of practical action rather than voiced concern, and she found this endearing rather than insufficient because she had learned his grammar. He rebuilt the porch steps so they would not be uneven. He moved the heavy items in the kitchen to lower shelves. he acquired from the Navarro family, a gentler horse for her use, and quietly retired the bay mare to lighter duty. He read, with a seriousness that made her love him so much she could not find adequate words for it, the medical almanac that Howard stocked in the store, and occasionally produced questions for her that were careful and practical and entirely characteristic of a man who processed love through competence. Their son was born on the 2nd of November, 1875, in the same bedroom where Raymond had spent 4 years sleeping alone, in the house that sat on the land that ran alongside the creek that James had named at 7 months. The birth was attended by Catalina Navarro, who had delivered half the children in the territory and was calm and skillful and spoke throughout in a mixture of Spanish and English that Rose found deeply comforting, the sounds of the words as much as the sense of them. The baby was healthy and large, and announced his arrival with a force that left no one in any doubt about the state of his lungs. Raymond, who had been relegated to the porch during the final stages by Catalina with a firmness he did not question, was allowed back in when it was over and stood in the doorway looking at Rose in the bed with the child in her arms with an expression she had never seen on his face and would never forget, the full and absolute weight of love without any protection against it, love received and given with nothing held back. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and Rose put the baby carefully into his arms, and Raymond held his son with the same care he held everything, precise and protective, and looked down at the small red face with those gray-green eyes that were entirely wet and not ashamed of it. "Hello," Raymond said very quietly. "Hello there." The baby, apparently satisfied with this greeting, made a small sound and closed his eyes. "What will we call him?" Rose said. Raymond looked at her over the baby's head, and she could see him thinking, and she waited because this was important and he would not say it quickly. "James," he said, "if you're willing. James Raymond Whitfield." Rose looked at her husband holding their son in the lamplight of the bedroom on the land that had been loved before and was being loved again, and she thought of the dried flowers in the blue glass jar that were still on the windowsill in the kitchen, that she had never moved and never intended to, and she thought of the 2 headstones on the far hill that Raymond tended with the same care he gave everything, and she understood that this was not replacement but continuation, not forgetting but honoring. "The way a river continues even after a drought. James Raymond Whitfield," she said. "Yes, that's exactly right." The following spring Howard Briggs sold the store to Rose and moved himself into the boarding house under Patience Eccles' management, which suited both of them so perfectly that the town spent approximately 3 weeks discussing whether Patience and Howard would themselves be the next Cutter's Creek wedding, a speculation that Howard deflected with apricot-eating serenity, and Patience deflected with cheerful, categorical, entirely unconvincing denial. The store became Sullivan Whitfield General Goods, though everyone in town called it Rose's Place, and Delia Marsh continued as the second clerk and became, over time, something between a colleague and a younger sister, with a gift for reading the character of suppliers that saved the store considerable money and occasional grief. Raymond expanded the cattle operation, carefully and in the way he did all things without overreach, adding to what he had built rather than gambling on something he hadn't. He hired 2 hands, brothers named Pete and Cal Aldridge, who were good workers and better listeners, and who regarded Raymond with the matter-of-fact respect of men who recognized competence and did not require it to perform itself. They built a second bunkhouse in the spring of 1876, and in the summer expanded the barn, and Raymond taught himself to work iron at the Navarro smithy well enough to do his own basic repairs, which Miguel regarded as a professional affront and a personal satisfaction in equal measure. James grew the way babies grow in that country, in the open air and at considerable speed. He was a solemn and curious child, like his predecessor and namesake, with his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's directness, and he was walking by 11 months, which made Raymond look at Rose with an expression of complete wonder and say, 11 months, to which Rose said yes, to which he said, "Same as." And he stopped, and she took his hand, and he finished, "Same as James the First," very quietly. And she felt the thread of love and memory that ran through the name and through the child and through everything they were building, and she held his hand tightly. By 1877, Cutter's Creek had grown enough to warrant a second general store, which opened at the east end of the main street and drew away some of the trade, and brought in new customers who hadn't bothered to travel to the West End. And on balance, Sullivan Whitfield came out ahead. There was also a proper doctor now, a young man from Philadelphia named Elias Marsh, who happened to be Delia's older brother, and who had followed his sister west with an adventurousness that his Philadelphia education had not entirely prepared him for, but that he was adapting to with good-humored persistence. Elias Marsh's arrival was, among other things, the occasion of considerable discussion because Clara Dietz, who had been teaching the children of Cutter's Creek for 3 years and crying quietly on Friday afternoons about her mother in Virginia, ceased crying on Friday afternoons approximately 6 weeks after Dr. Marsh arrived, a circumstance that the town noted with the communal satisfaction of a place that has grown fond of its people. Rose watched all of this from her counter with the pleasure of a woman who had found herself, unexpectedly and perfectly, at the center of a community she loved. People came to the store for their supplies and stayed to talk, and she listened to all of it with the same quality of attention she had always given to things that mattered, and knew everyone's worries and hopes and small dignities, and kept all of it with the discretion of someone who understood that trust, once given, must be protected. The Navarro family remained the anchor of what was solid and good in the town, Miguel's ironwork indispensable, Catalina's herbs in the windows of her house still making it smell like somewhere luminous, the 2 eldest sons increasingly skilled and increasingly courted by the girls of the county. When Catalina brought her youngest daughter into the store one afternoon in 1877, and Rose noticed that the girl, who was 18 and already more capable than most adults, was eyeing Pete Aldridge through the window with an expression of profound consideration, she said nothing, and did nothing except ensure that the next time Pete came in for supplies she mentioned that Catalina's family would be at the summer gathering, and that Catalina's youngest daughter, who was called Marisol, had a particular gift for knowing good horses from bad ones and liked to talk about it, which made Pete Aldridge look thoughtful in a way that Rose recognized. It was, she thought, something like adding honey to a supply list. You put a good thing in front of someone and you waited to see if they would pick it up. In the fall of 1877, Rose discovered she was expecting again. She told Raymond on a Thursday, as she had told him the first time, because Thursday was their day, the day that had started everything, and he responded as he had the first time with hands and eyes and a steadiness that was also its own kind of joy. Their second child was a daughter, born in April of 1878, a spring baby, with the warm weather coming in through the open windows of the bedroom and Catalina once again steady and capable and murmuring in her beautiful 2-language way. The baby was small and fierce, and had Rose's dark hair and Raymond's gray-green eyes and the combined stubbornness of both parents in a concentration that Catalina pronounced, with the authority of experience, highly promising. They named her Alina. Rose had suggested it, one evening in the 7th month, sitting with Raymond at the kitchen table with the lamplight between them. She had said it simply, watching his face, and he had been still for a long moment, and then he had looked at her with an expression she would carry for the rest of her life. "Alina Rose Whitfield," he said. "If you want that," she said, "if it feels right." "It feels," he said carefully, "like the right thing, like the whole thing being honored." Alina Rose Whitfield was, from her first week of life, a person with opinions. She had them about food and light and noise and the angle at which she was held, and she expressed them clearly and without hesitation, which made her parents look at each other frequently over her head with expressions of helpless amusement and profound pride. James adored his sister with the complete and uncomplicated devotion of a 3-year-old who has not yet learned that the world might give him reasons not to, and he appointed himself her guardian in a way that was touching and occasionally ineffective and entirely sincere. The years moved the way good years move, with the texture of daily life that is made up of small, beautiful things accumulating into something substantial. There was the year the creek flooded in spring and took out the lower fence in Raymond, and the Aldridge brothers spent 3 weeks rebuilding it, muddy and cheerful and competitive about who could drive a post most efficiently. There was the year a traveling merchant brought a piano to Cutter's Creek, and Patience Eccles bought it for the boarding house parlor without hesitation, and then discovered she could not play it and spent an entertaining 6 months learning, to the patient suffering of everyone within earshot, before achieving a competency that made Sunday evenings in the parlor genuinely pleasant. There was the year a drought came through and was hard, particularly on the smaller ranchers, and Raymond organized a collective water-sharing arrangement with 4 neighboring spreads that was so practical and equitable that it became the standard for the area and was referenced in a letter to the Elko paper. There was the Thursday in 1879, which Rose noted privately and with full ceremony, which was 5 years from the Thursday Raymond had first come through the door of Briggs General Goods with his list. She was behind the counter of Sullivan Whitfield when the door opened and Raymond came in, and the bell made its small copper sound, and he was carrying James on one shoulder and leading Alina by the hand, and he set his supply list on the counter, and she unfolded it and read it, and there at the bottom in his small, careful hand were the familiar items: honey, 1 tin, dried apricots, and a new edition that had appeared in the last year, written with the same deliberate care as all the rest: rose hip balm if available. Alina's hands get dry. She looked up at him with a feeling in her chest that was the size of everything. He was looking back at her over Alina's head with those gray-green eyes that were warm and open and entirely his, and he was almost smiling in that way of his, the architectural suggestion that was more expressive than most men's fullest grins. 5 years, she said. 5 years, he agreed. You've added a great many non-essential items to that list. I have, he said. I expect I'll keep adding them. James, who was 4 and had his mother's nose and his father's serious regard for the world, looked between his parents with the air of someone enduring a private joke and said, with considerable dignity, "Can I have an apricot?" "Yes," said Rose, and gave him one. Alina, who had recently learned to walk with confidence and applied this skill to everything including situations where standing still would have been more appropriate, made a determined movement toward the lower shelves, and Raymond scooped her up with one arm without looking, the automatic reflex of a man who had learned to anticipate her horizontal ambitions, and she protested loudly, and he held her against his chest, and she subsided, temporarily appeased by proximity to his shirt button, which she found interesting. Rose gathered Raymond's order and tallied it, and he paid in the exact coin he had always paid in, and she put the parcel together, and he loaded it into his saddlebag, and they were in all visible respects conducting a simple commercial transaction. Except that it had never been, had been from the beginning a conversation about something else entirely, a negotiation between a man who said he was done with soft things and a woman who had known, with the quiet certainty of someone paying attention on the right frequency, that he wasn't done at all. He was just waiting for someone to add the honey. The day Raymond Whitfield rode home from Sullivan Whitfield General Goods that Thursday in 1879, with the October air cool and clean, and the aspen going gold on the hills, and James sitting in front of him on the saddle, because the boy had finally been allowed to ride home from town, and was incandescent with the honor of it, and Alina riding with Rose on the bay mare beside them, their little family moving through the desert afternoon that was copper and blue and full of everything. He thought about the list in his saddlebag. He thought about the first time he had written honey on it himself, that careful addition in small letters, that act of decided return. He thought about what it had meant, what it had cost in terms of the protection he had been so determined to keep, and what it had gained. Everything, he thought. It had gained everything. They arrived home in the amber late afternoon light, and Alina immediately went to sleep on Rose's shoulder with the totality of a very small person who has decided that consciousness is, for the moment, no longer necessary. James climbed carefully down from the horse with the air of someone landing on a foreign continent, and immediately went to find the barn cat. Raymond unsaddled the horses and led them to water and did his evening chores with the efficiency and satisfaction of a man who knows his work and loves his land, and has learned to know the difference between being closed and being empty. When he came into the kitchen, the lamp was lit and the stove was going, and the smell of supper was in the air, and Rose was at the table with Alina asleep in the bedroom and James at her elbow, asking questions about why dirt was brown and not green, and she was answering each question with the seriousness it deserved, which was entirely characteristic. Raymond hung his hat by the door and washed his hands and came to the table and sat down across from his wife, and she looked up from James's question about dirt to look at him. And for a moment they simply looked at each other across the lamplight, the way they had first sat across from each other in this same kitchen years ago, the night she had come to warn him about Crane, except that now everything between them was mapped and known and loved and chosen, and the look between them contained all of that. "Good Thursday," she said. "Very good Thursday," he said. James, undeterred by the interruption of adult communication, returned to the matter of brown dirt. On the shelf beside the stove, the 2 tins of honey sat together, the current one half full, a new one waiting. On the kitchen windowsill, the blue glass jar held fresh wildflowers that Raymond had picked that morning from the hillside, the dried ones long since composted back into the land they had come from, new ones always arriving in their place, because the hillside kept making them and he kept bringing them in. The headstones on the far hill were clean, tended last Sunday as they always were, the names on them part of this place as surely as the creek and the aspen and the red Nevada soil, honored and held and not forgotten. The night came down over the land that was theirs, and the stars came out with their architectural extravagance, and inside the house the lamp burned warm, and Raymond Whitfield, who had said he was done with soft things, spread honey on his bread with the careful pleasure of a man who has found his way back to everything worth having, and has the wisdom to know it and the intention to keep it every day, every week, every ordinary and extraordinary Thursday for the rest of his life. Rose watched him from across the table and said nothing because nothing needed to be said, only felt, and what she felt was complete. The desert was full out there beyond the windows, full in exactly the way she had told him it was, on a rainy Thursday in a general store that no longer belonged to Howard Briggs, back when Raymond Whitfield was still a man with a list, and she was still learning his grammar. What she had not known then, because you cannot know it until you are inside it, is that the fullness would keep increasing, that there was no ceiling on it. That love of this particular quality, this texture, this weight, was not a fixed thing you arrived at and stayed inside, but a living thing that grew with every Thursday and every honey tin and every sleeping child and every evening of lamplight and conversation, and the particular silence of 2 people who have found each other completely. James fell asleep at the table, as he occasionally did when the questions and the day became too much at once, and Raymond lifted him without waking him and carried him to bed with those careful hands. And when he came back to the kitchen, Rose was washing the supper things, and he came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him, and they stood for a moment in the warm kitchen of the house on the land beside the creek with everything settled around them, perfectly and fully and without reservation, and outside the Nevada night was cold and vast and brilliant, and inside there was enough light and enough warmth and enough honey left in the tin for tomorrow.